Welcome, everyone. This is a session on Urbit and gaming, probably the dopest session this entire weekend because we all know that games are the thing that actually lead adoption of new technology. We've got a pretty varied panel here. So to start us off, I'm just going to go through and let everyone introduce themselves and tell you a little bit about their current project and their history of gaming. My introduction, I'm Chase, CEO of Vaporware, one of the newer Urbit companies doing stuff with NFTs. If you didn't see it, we announced Milady.os earlier today. Come find me after if you want to talk about that. Lewis, you want to kick us off?
Sure. Yeah, my name's Lewis. Vocationally software engineer, did mostly work with like Solidity and Ethereum, and got really interested in meeting these guys who made this game called Dark Forest, which some of you may have heard about. This really cool group called Lattice Studios, and part of this think tank called Autonomous Worlds. They're really exploring what does it mean to have a game that runs on a blockchain. What are the differences between games that run on blockchains and other applications on blockchains, and what's the crossover there? And building a lot of interesting technology to facilitate Web3 gaming. And so I've just, as a hobby, been building a game that's exploring some of these concepts, and we can talk more about that.
Yeah, hi everyone. My name is Blackstone, CEO of Patriots Division. We're building Shadow War, as you guys can see. Some of you guys may have seen a few of those materials downstairs, as well as some of these business cards in the bags we have. But yeah, it's a game built in Unreal Engine 5 versus 5, really trying to go for that AAA feel. I think crypto and Web3 probably doesn't have anything close to Web3 right now, but it's as close to AAA right now, but trying to get it as close to AAA as possible. But yeah, we've been building on that for the last 2 years, and a lot of that game, whether it's narrative or the way the systems work, has actually been inspired by Urbit. Huge Urbit bull myself for the past, 4 or 5 years now, so really interested in Urbit, and yeah, this is just a great event. Glad to be here with everyone here on the panel.
Hey everyone, I'm Trent, aka hanful-dovned. I'm a game developer building fun software on Urbit. About a year ago, I made a game called Slam, which integrates Gora into this arcade game. I put out Board a few months ago. I worked on Tharsis with Vaporware, and now, just earlier this week, I put out an app called Micro, which is like TikTok, but for Urbit apps. And so, very excited to be working on that, very excited to be seeing what other people have been doing with it this past week, and yeah, lots of fun times ahead.
First of all, I want to apologize. My voice is kind of disappearing. I'll do my best. I'm John Hyde, also known as midlev-minder. I'm working on Turf, which is like a 2D metaverse on Urbit. Currently no blockchain integration, but basically, you get to move around from turf to turf and explore and create things. So my background in games is I was a kid and didn't have a game console, but I played educational CD-ROM games like Zoom Beanies, if you ever heard of that, pattern matching, whatnot. I didn't have the traditional game experience. I only played Pokemon on an emulator in high school. But yeah, I like games. I really like puzzle games in particular, and games with a good story. Turf is, for me, it's less of a game and more of a social app, but there's definitely, as far as the technical form of it, it's game-like. So hopefully I have something to contribute about the technical challenges of building a multiplayer game-like thing on Urbit.
Awesome. I think one of the through lines for everyone on this stage is grappling with this problem of state in fully distributed games, fully decentralized games. Trent and I worked on a game together called Tharsis, which is one of the first sort of Urbit native PvP games. And something that we realized in doing that was that there would be opportunities for players to ignore state or interpret state in different ways. So even if each player was accepting sort of a single set of canonical state, their apps could do things with that state differently from what other players. And John, I think what you're working on, Turf, is a particularly interesting example of this. How do you think about state with respect to Turf, whether it be the items or the location of players or even what it means to be in one of these Turf spaces?
Yeah. So, in a normal game, there's just one program running on the computer, and it has full say over what happens in the state. With a multiplayer game, often you'll see different servers running, and so those will be sort of siloed. If you're in this server is taking care of game state, and this other server is taking care of other people's game state. And if it's if there's supposed to be some global shared state between those, they'll have some sort of way of updating each other. With Turf, there's not really any sense of global state. The only global state is a person's avatar, what they look like and what they're wearing. So currently, each person just gets to decide what they look like, and the person who hosts the turf gets to decide if they respect that decision. So within a turf, all the authority belongs to the host of the turf, and so any global state that's represented there is just the host's interpretation of the global state. So if you come into my turf wearing, a silly hat, and I have a rule against silly hats, maybe I have some image recognition software that says, okay, that hat is too silly. I have the power as the turf host to say, no, you're not wearing that hat. I'm not going to show that in my turf. So the game state is very particular to each turf, and so we can try to project global state, but unless we're going to settle on a blockchain, really we have to accept a local authority for state in each turf, and I think it makes sense to give that power to the host of the turf.
Do you have thoughts on this too, Trent? I know you've spent a bunch of time thinking about sort of variable state.
I mean, it's so cool to see what John is doing with Turf and your logic behind it, because it mirrors so many conversations that Chase and I have had a million times when it comes to this idea of the blockchain being global state that's non-negotiable, but then when you pair that with Urbit, you get this layer where it's a little more negotiable, and you can have hosts that kind of bend the rules a little bit. I think that pairing blockchain with Urbit creates this unique gameplay experience that you couldn't just have on a Web 2 centralized server, because with blockchain paired with Urbit, you get this global server-like state that people can't argue with, but then you also get nodes where each person can have their own sort of parallel universe where they can do whatever they want. Like someone running Turf on their star, I mean, presumably they could just install a completely different agent that happens to interface with other people's Turf agents, and they could do something totally wild with it. And I think that stuff is super exciting.
So you can actually have a case where interacting with Turf can trigger other kinds of things. Can trigger your Urbit to do other kinds of things. It's not just a game. It's somewhat more fully integrated, and so the state kind of leaks out into other kinds of agents.
Yeah.
That's the plan. It's not the case.
Yeah.
But yeah.
And Roy, Lewis, you guys are almost at the opposite end of this. Working on purely blockchain games is all about having a global canonical set of state to pull from. Roy, I know you and I have spent some time talking about the areas in which that's nice to have for a game, and the areas where having something a little bit more dynamic and flexible for a game is more worthwhile, like inventory items and the way that players communicate. How do you think about sort of the dynamic that on one end of the spectrum Urbit offers, and on the other end of the spectrum a blockchain game offers?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've even seen in the market, right? The most successful video games, I think, of all time, historically, are generally games that are made that are mods. For example, you're looking at Dota, Defense of the Ancients, League of Legends. These are all mods, and they grew on to be these successful games. And I think recently we've seen even with Fortnite, Epic Games has released Fortnite for Unreal Engine, which is a way that people can create content. So this all sort of loops back into this idea of user-generated content. If I can take state, this global state onto my ship, and then I can change things on my sort of my ship, and then I have my own rules. Then all of a sudden, what I have just sort of created is we've kind of just reverse engineered this idea of, well, now we have UGC. Now I can go join custom games. I can join custom lobbies that have different rule sets, different game modes, different types of games. And then what you're going to see is you're going to get this sort of Cambrian explosion of wow, you're playing one game. In this case, it would be something like Shadow War, but I'm connecting with my friend who's also playing this game, but with different rules, and now we can play a million different games, all sort of based on one sort of base truth. So I think it's super valuable. I think that's actually probably going to be one of the games of the future. Like all the games of the future are going to have this sort of technology, and using Urbit, you kind of get that for free.
Yeah.
It just sort of comes out of the box. So it's really great.
It reminds me so much of the Dark Forest, Lewis, which you've talked about. I think one of the successes of that game was that the developers provided a piece of infrastructure, the core game mechanics, but very quickly the thing that I think that the most competitive players found was that modding and scripting and sort of creating plugins for that game was like that became a core piece of the strategy for it. That sounds very similar, like a similar kind of thing that we're imagining for Urbit, but it's like Roy said, sort of like based off of this kernel. Do you have thoughts on like where the blockchain aspect, the global state enables this and how it enables it, and whether something like Urbit would sort of express that differently?
Right. Well, talking like specifically on the global state and like what that affords you, well, like immediately like a global uncensorable like multiplayer server out of the box, right, which is pretty great. And then being able to define what's called, let's say, like the diegetic boundaries of your world very specifically, or rather like what is the game? What are the contours of the game? And if it's like a game, let's say, that's encoded on the blockchain by rules of a bunch of smart contracts, those rules are like very explicit in like who can do what under what circumstances. But then, see, that's the hard physics of the game. But then with any kind of like Dark Forest or other games that take advantage of a lot of capacities of the chain, well, you have like what's on chain, like governance and economies and various other things that require perhaps like a lot of off-chain planning, a lot of off-chain communication, a lot of scripting, things that are like secondary to the manipulation of the on-chain rule set, but nevertheless are like a natural and necessary part of the game world itself. So I think that's particularly where Urbit can serve a very useful function.
What would that look like?
Well, I think, for example, like chat is one good thing. It's like, what are the modalities, like the social modalities that people like to and find like efficient for participating in certain games, right? Whereas I see, yes, like the blockchain it's written in stone, and these are like the hard rules that define like who's winning, who's losing, where are certain resources in the game. But then you want to like communicate with your team and your squad and your ship, and like how does that look like? What is that social coordination mechanism? Is there something better than like a Signal like or Telegram group chat that could facilitate that? And beyond that, could you like start building in custom integrations from that, like let's say, like bespoke, like secondary social aspect of the game into the controls of the game, like creating your own like UIs for your gang, etc.
Right.
That's particularly where Urbit I see has a useful function.
That's super interesting, Roy. We've actually talked about that use case for Urbit and crypto games in the past. This idea of layering on sort of this decentralized social layer, where sure, like Lewis is saying, you want some system, maybe it's blockchain in the case of Dark Forest and some of the things that you're working on, or maybe it's a centralized company in another one, providing some like, I think you said, like physical laws almost for the game to operate on. But then if there are things outside of that core kernel, do you necessarily want a single entity to control it?
Yeah, I mean, I think in general, like it's all about. I think this whole idea of like gaming in general and how we're talking about it is like it's a bigger discussion about like societies and how people talk in general. So if I'm playing a game, the most successful games are like social games, and so whether that's sort of World of Warcraft or whatever it might be, whatever MMO people are playing these days, it's all about the rules that we kind of set. And so like if the thing that's nice about Urbit is everything becomes suddenly so much more modular by using planets and ships, and so you really can have everything down to the granular level of like different games will have different rules, or maybe the same game can have different rule sets, and I think that is super interesting. And I think what we're going to get is we're going to get a lot of games that sort of leverage this, that games that can't even exist until we see what you can do with Urbit, and then people will leverage that technology to create new games. And they'll look nothing like what we've seen these days. It'll be like, hey, I've taken this cool NFT and I've combined it with an Urbit. I've turned it into a computer, and now I can do a bunch of cool things that first you couldn't do with NFTs, second you couldn't do with games, but now you can do, at sort of this really cool combination. So that's something that I think is super, super interesting.
Yeah. NFTs are interesting. Obviously, Vaporware is doing a bunch of stuff with NFTs, and we think NFTs are a more general, useful tool than just the pure speculation that has sort of existed with them up until this point. But, I mean, Lewis, you've spent a bunch of time working in the blockchain space. Isn't it the case that using blockchains just necessitates the total financialization of games, or do you think there's a different way of using that technology, or maybe that's not even a bad thing? Maybe it's just we've seen low quality efforts at this so far.
Yeah, I think what I would call preliminary, and what I'd say total financialization. Well, let's say in one sense it comes out of the box, right? And in another sense, what types of games people choose to play and what types of games are popular are the result of people finding them interesting or socially engaging, or their friends are playing them. So perhaps games that are overly financialized perhaps will fall into a trap of not attracting players. Now, but I think this is all kind of a subset of with blockchain gaming. Yes, things can start to become heavily financialized, or rather, it's if you are building a game on smart contracts, perhaps that game is Turing complete, or has the potential to become Turing complete within its own rules, or perhaps within another set of rules that abducts the rules of that system. So it's more, I see, it's could it become hyper financialized? Yes. And it can kind of become anything.
Yeah.
It can transcend its own nature, and through tools that are very native to blockchain, through governance systems and tokens, NFTs, et cetera, and start to become and evolve into new beasts.
Yeah, that's very interesting. This idea of games sort of existing within a world and then kind of leaking out into the world around it. Trent, I think you've called this parallel worlds in the past. And you've used examples even from the speedrunning community that they'll sort of push games past what the developer intended. How do you think about that with respect to a system like Urbit that does give you just so much inherent flexibility with it?
Yeah. So this parallel universes idea is you have Mario 64, and it is the game that it is, where you play through it and you jump around and you beat Bowser and everything. But then there's also this metagame layer that people have put on top of it, where they try to beat it without pressing the A button, which you would think is kind of straightforward, but you end up having to decompile assembly code and get into deep computer science in order to do this. And at this point, these people aren't playing Mario 64 anymore. They're playing this parallel game that exists on top of Mario 64. And I think with Urbit,
which is beat this challenge.
Exactly. Yeah. And we see people already doing this on Urbit, where it's you'll have the Gora app, where it's kind of intended to be proof of attendance for conferences, but then you'll have Minder-Folden, who designs this crazy accountability card game out of it, where he draws a random card each week, and then he assigns it to different people depending on if they beat their weekly goals, and then at the end of the year, whoever has the best hand wins. Gora was not designed with that use case in mind, but that was a parallel game that was created on top of it through people's creativity. And I think what makes Urbit so good for that is that there's so much imagination that goes into the apps, and maybe the data ownership has a role to play there. I forget who it was in our email thread who was talking about the boundaries between games and real life, and how games can be used to draw people's attention to real life challenges. But I think that's such a fascinating topic.
Yeah. The idea of sort of bending the game and breaking the game and setting up challenges that are external to the game but still expressed in the game is very interesting. John, is it possible to cheat inside Turf? What would it mean to cheat in Turf?
So there's one cheat which is currently pretty easy because I haven't done much to prevent it. But if you have a wall, you're not allowed to walk through it. Then to teleport to their side would be cheating.
Are we getting some deep like alpha here on like cheating in Turf?
Basically, all you have to do is send a poke saying, I move here, and the backend is like, oh, cool, good job.
Okay.
It's just like, if you try to move into a wall, it'll block you, but if you move past it, it doesn't check that you have a solid, like a continuous path through. So you can't do that from the UI unless something is like not updated. But if you know how to send pokes, you can.
And by poke, you mean like you would go into the terminal and you would send some data to your Urbit manually that would then be reflected in Turf.
Yeah.
Which is an interesting, it's interesting that this game sort of has this secondary interface, right? Because it lives on this machine that you own in this way that you can do things like that if you understand the system, which is different than a game console, unless you're disassembling bytecode and I don't know, doing crazy things, but.
Yeah, so like a Turf speedrun is just writing Hoon and
yeah, that's right.
Of pokes, yeah.
Yeah.
Trent, how is Urbit like Homestar Runner?
Yeah, so this is an idea that I kind of stole from Neil Davis, but he has a great Twitter thread about how Urbit is the new Homestar Runner. And so for those of you who don't know, Homestar Runner was this Flash website from the early 2000s where you'd go to the main page and it had a few different sections. It had cartoons and games and shop and characters and everything. But as you delved into the website, you started to see that the lines between these different ways of interacting with the website were blurred. And so it was all just Flash content. So you'd be watching a cartoon, but maybe there's a thing that you can click on in the cartoon that triggers a hidden scene that you wouldn't otherwise have gotten. And at that point, is it a cartoon or is it a game? And then there's an Easter egg at the end of it where you click and it takes you to a game. And you start to realize that it's like a cohesive experience where all of these different types of things are weaving together in very natural ways that kind of blur the lines of cartoons and games. And the reason why I think Urbit is similar to Homestar Runner is because you can combine its apps in these weird ways. Even if the composability isn't there from the intent of the developers, you can still do it if you put in a little bit of manual effort. So to give another example that Minderfolden did recently, some Urbit developers recently put out an app called Emissary, which allows you to take a star and then assign a planet to that star to act as a representative of that star. And so Minderfolden had people drop screenshots of their Emissary app in his chat, and he made a group chat for people who happened to have done that. And that's this interesting blending of Emissary and groups that wasn't really intended and isn't even really implemented yet, but you can do that because all this stuff is on the same computer and it's all the same community and the same login, and it just feels like such a cohesive ecosystem that it acts as a sandbox for people to do these very imaginative things inside of.
Yeah, that's super interesting. Urbit definitely is special in that things tend to be built by one person. I think you've given a few examples. Turf, like John has been a solo developer on Turf for a good while. So it's interesting that the platform lends itself to these smaller applications and this experimentation. I think on the far end of that spectrum, or the opposite end of that spectrum, are these AAA games, which Roy, I think you probably have more experience than anyone else on the panel in this world. I'd love to hear about some of the challenges of AAA game development with respect especially to crypto assets. The things that I'm most familiar with there are maybe Axie Infinity, that's much more like a card, like a collectible game or a turn-based game. And from what I've seen, Shadow War is extremely polished, quite a demanding modern game. So can you give us some ideas of the unique challenges there?
Yeah, I guess the first challenge is no one knows what the hell anyone is doing in crypto, right? So how do you properly, like what's the best formula? What's the best mix of, Web 2 and Web 3? So if you try to make a AAA game, gamers have like this sort of expectation of like, well, first we want live design, secondly we want, this sort of the quality, we want X, Y, and Z thing, and if you're missing any of those, you're going to be pissed. So now all of a sudden you have a bunch of people that are mad at you. But then on top of that, the additional challenge is like, well, how do you mix all of this with this Web 3 idea? And then I think even on top of that, I've been doing a lot of thinking of how we can mix that with Urbit, actually, and how we can sort of integrate that within the Urbit ecosystem. And I think the answer is that I'm actually not sure. I think in general, Urbit is so vast and it's so interesting that other developers will probably take things that we've made and we've built and build their own things with it, which is sort of the idea.
Yeah.
Is that you have to, at a certain point, there's a certain level of, you have to be humble about it and be like, okay, I don't know all the answers, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to leave some clues and see what other people think and what other people take. So that's sort of, I think, the academic side of it, of trying to sort of reconcile, new technology with, say, old technology. Games aren't that old. But, and then on the other side, it's like, the actual nuts and bolts of it. There is no crypto for Unreal Engine plugin. I mean, they kind of exist, but they're kind of shitty. There's no, like, no one's doing this for Urbit. So this is an interesting area that I think would be great. What if you could actually, run this in Unreal Engine, and all of a sudden it's interfacing with Urbit. You can maybe have like an achievement, and then this achievement pops up in your chat, and then someone else, your friend who doesn't even play the game, they're like, hey, this guy just got this achievement. That's really cool. I can go view his NFT collection and see that. And like, sort of what you were saying before, it's like, are we playing a game anymore? Are we talking? Are we on a social media app? Like, what the hell are we doing? We don't know. It's Urbit. It's a game. We're socializing. That's what it's all about.
Haven't games always been like that? Like I was very into WoW in college. And frequently I would just log in and like shit talk with my friends. And that was like
Yeah, that was the game.
Yeah, that was the game. It was like you sit around and like, the auction house, and you're like flipping enchanting recipes, shit talking with your buddies. I think what's interesting to what you're like gesturing at is that can still be true, but some of that can exist outside of the game, and maybe that's a little bit more expansive. But it also presents, like, I imagine, architectural challenges, like technology integration challenges. How are you integrating like the crypto assets into Shadow War? If Unity or
yeah. So I think on the narrative level, we definitely talk a lot about crypto and things. I mean, so just to give everyone a basic primer of it, Shadow War basically the game takes place in 2050, and this like massive super AI took over the world. But then on top of that, there were some really bright people who kind of developed this system that is very similar to Urbit, actually. So again, I drew a lot of inspiration from Urbit. But the idea, again, is you're mixing the real world with this sort of fantasy, with this video game. So, we have a crypto asset. It's called Shadow Credits, which is a real crypto asset in the real world, but it's also an asset in the game. So that's one of the ways that we're sort of mixing things between the narrative and the real world. We have people who have set up these servers all over the world, and they're all decentralized, and people run their own personal servers. And they're running this program called Argo. Well, what do you know? It's pretty much it's just Urbit. So so this is sort of the ways that we're kind of
many cases things where we discover that someone else running some little piece of Urbit already.
Exactly. So that's sort of the way we're kind of mixing things. And then on top of that, technologically, like we're basically giving people these NFTs, and then with these NFTs, we are trying to give people more than the traditional NFT experience. Because like right now, if you have an NFT, it's kind of like a JPEG, and you look at it, and that's sort of it. But really what we can do with Urbit specifically is like, well, now your NFT can be like a chat program, right? Well, now you can boot a ship on it, and it can be a program. It can run software. It can talk to other people. It can do things on the internet. So suddenly like this whole world of possibilities is starting to open up if you actually like integrate this sort of NFT technology with what you can do on Urbit. So that's sort of the way we're kind of combining things.
Yeah. Louis, I'd love to hear more about the way that you're using blockchain, which I think it's a little bit different than, Roy, what you've been talking about, right? Like it's less focused on maybe individual game assets, but more about the laws of the world.
Right. Yeah, so thinking of, let's say, from like a smart contract first approach of like, okay, let's build a game that's defined by a series of smart contracts, and then we'll figure out, I don't know, like the displays and like other things later. like what can you do with that? I don't know, has anyone here ever heard of a game called Nomic? No, maybe some governance nerds. But essentially, it's a very simple kind of like thought experiment game, and in like community living, sometimes you might be forced to play where like everyone sits in a circle and rolls a die, and then if you add it to your score. If you make 100 points, you win, and then after you roll the die, you propose a new rule, and then everyone votes on whether they want to accept that rule as part of the rules of this game, and it passes or not, and then it moves to the next person. And so this game is like intentionally kind of dull, but the whole point being it's about rule production, and you can like make the game into anything through this like simple process. So thinking in like the blockchain of like, okay, let's think as a thought experiment, put that game on chain. They're like, okay, we have like a minimally viable game world that's just about rule production. So we're thinking more not like what is the game, but what could the game be? And like what game might be fun and interesting. And maybe it like implodes and okay, that was like recorded in history. We like nuked the game, and other ones perhaps like evolve into more steady states. And then naturally it's like, oh yeah, we're gonna plug in quadratic voting into our game world, and then we're gonna mint some NFTs from our game world, and then like you can start to have gameplay that's more just interactive,
Right.
programmatic. People can start to like put their own rules into the world. So like thinking of this as a design principle for games, not necessarily needing to be these like thought experiments, but in a certain game world of being like, okay, here's like a limited slice of like allowing the players to perhaps change the internal rules of the game, or then even going so far as to like add an external smart contract, and perhaps the game has like the capacity to become Turing complete or more so through that way.
It's an interesting, it's like an interesting blending where designing the game and playing the game kind of merge together. Like I imagine there are some players still that just like they just want to play the game, like they just want to like turn their brain off or get very good at the particular mechanics. Like, do you think there's a place in sort of like every game for this where players can kind of modify it themselves, right. Or do you think there are places where it makes sense just to have a fixed set of rules?
Right. I mean, I think it's highly dependent on the game, and it's like thinking less of what like a game is and what a game can be, or like as I really like the mental model presented from the movie like Ready Player One, or like For All Its Faults. It's like, okay, here's like a far future world that's like completely integrated with this like metaverse where like playing in the game it's what you do. It's considered like work and it's everything. It's life, because it's like your integration as a human subject with the virtual has become so complete. And so that comes with everything that's very human, like socialization, chat, like governance systems, currencies, like all of those things that you need to build a society are like nascent in the construction of the game. And classically, perhaps like game worlds were like bounded, like, okay, we know when to put the game away,
yeah.
And it's over. But already we're seeing that like breaking out of the box. So even things like EVE Online, you know, it's like people have done real world schemes because they know like there's an in-world currency of ISK in this game that people are like manipulating and waging war in the game that has like
it's
weird.
It's famously a spreadsheet heavy game.
A spreadsheet simulator, and yes, I think like spreadsheet simulators are particularly well positioned to be built on the blockchain.
That's very interesting. Earlier you mentioned Lattice, which is a company building sort of technology infrastructure on Ethereum. And we were talking, Roy was talking about some of the challenges of there not being a trodden path to follow around this. And I know that that's one of the things that Lattice is thinking about, is how can we sort of decrease the barrier for developers to build at least some of the style of game that you've been talking about. Maybe it's not designed at the AAA game developer that cares more about graphics or performance or sort of competitive play. I'd love to hear a little bit more about Lattice if you've had experience with it.
And I've built things on their framework, and I'd say, yeah, pretty incredible, and like not just how they do like state management on chain in a very like sensible way that can like is a good ontology for building games, but also in like kind of the middleware and even into like the front end as well.
And what does it allow you to do as a game developer? What are some of the tools that it provides you?
I mean, I think it allows you to get started quickly and like build a game, like an on-chain game that isn't fully from scratch. So it gives you like really nice, first like again, like ontology for like how you want to build your like state system, and then tools for like middleware and front end, so you can just kind of make them much more quickly without having to do everything yourself from scratch. And that's why I think a lot of people have been using it recently. In fact, I think, I believe even like the EVE Online team is launching a new game that's going to be blockchain integrated in some capacity.
Okay.
And I believe, and, don't at me, but check it out. Like I think they're using Lattice as their blockchain like engine component.
Yeah, it's interesting. I got very excited when I saw Lattice because the parallels to Urbit development were clear to me immediately. Trent, that's something that you and I had talked about, was just like, especially as we were going through developing Tharsis. Tharsis is a game that supports up to 10 players on a single game board. It's somewhat turn-based, but within sort of the bounds of a turn, players can move asynchronously. And this was fucking hard. Like building this out, dealing with like getting like the boilerplate up and running, dealing with game state. How are you thinking about like game development within Urbit and some of the tools that we might need there?
Yeah, I think it's interesting how Tharsis is sort of a client-server app that we designed as a peer-to-peer app, because at the time that was kind of the only way to make Urbit apps, is that you distribute the agent to everyone who uses the app, and then you write the code in such a way that the people who are using the app can interface with each other. We kind of stapled a client-server architecture on top of that peer-to-peer like fundamental architecture.
It was federated in some ways. Like players could choose to run their own server if they wanted to.
Yeah. I think that EOF makes that even more powerful though, because now you can have an app that you just run on your ship, and then clients can just log into your ship and use that app without even having to download the code to their own ship.
And what is EOF, just for the benefit of the listeners?
Yeah. So EOF is a mechanism that allows, so let's say harden-hardys is running an app on his ship, and I, hanful-dovned, want to use that app and write to it as myself. Well, I can go to harden-hardys' URL and press a special button that tells his ship to poke my ship, and in that poke it will say, hey, hanful-dovned, do you agree that I can associate this cookie with your ship? And then I will go to my ship and I will press OK on that, and then your ship will treat all of the in-browser actions that I take on the web page that you're serving to me as though they came from my ship.
So I can like my identity in the network as we're communicating with people can kind of piggyback through your ship. If I maybe don't have access to mine for whatever reason, I can sort of like temporarily log in via something that you've given me access to, and have some interaction with the Urbit network without going through my own Urbit node.
Sort of, yeah. You do need to have a running node that you have access to in order to confirm the access request. But in principle, you could envision a version of this where maybe you don't even need a node, and maybe you just have an ID.
I see.
And maybe you use something like mask to authenticate in. I'm sure there are weird technical implications there, but you could envision a version of Urbit where it is a little more client-server, and the clients are just people who have IDs but aren't actually running their own node.
And so
better or worse.
bringing that back to the gaming context, like how users access games is a challenge right now. How games are served to users is a challenge right now on Urbit. Maybe this EOF tool, this like bring in identity and log in, which is not unlike, I think, some of the things that Roy is talking about too. It's like one variation of a tool that we could use. Are there other like I think Lattice offers sort of this entity component system, right? Which is a way of representing certain objects, certain pieces of state within a game and managing that. Are there things like that you think Urbit would benefit from, either generally or specifically with respect to gaming?
Maybe. I think I need to think harder about it, but I don't know if you guys have any more to chime in with. But
I got nothing. I think it's really cool if you can get people who can, like, I think that, we're talking about like fragmentation here.
Yeah.
Essentially, we're talking about like fragmentation, and I think in gaming, like what that essentially equals out to is like someone is playing a video game on his PC, and I'm on my mobile, and I can't actually like talk to this guy because I can't run it on my phone, right? So the way you would do that in like an Urbit context, or in this context with EOF, is you just like sort of delegate it, right? So I can like talk to this person, I can simulate that I'm like running a node, and I'm talking to this person this way, and then that way, now all of a sudden I don't need to even play this game to actually talk to the people who are, within that game. So I think there's definitely like applications there, like easy applications, because people love talking to their friends, whether they're playing the game or not.
Yeah. John, I've been trying to let your voice rest a little bit. Let me know if it's feeling scratchy. But I mean, Turf is probably the largest like Urbit native gaming code base to date, and I would love like just your perspective on the infrastructure that was there. I know you had to do a lot of work to get things like just players in the same space working correctly. So if there are learnings from that for the Urbit community or other Urbit developers that are maybe less interested in end user applications and more interested in infrastructure and tool building, that'd be super interesting.
Yeah. If my voice will cooperate. I'm really struggling to talk. But yeah, so Turf has a unique challenge in that it's sort of a client-server model, because when you're in a Turf, Turf is the server and you're the client, but everyone is also a server because they have their own Turf, and you want to be able to switch between those modes quickly and seamlessly. So something like an EOF model doesn't work as well for Turf. It could be fun to let people like preview a Turf, but ultimately you want to have each person have a Turf installed and have it act as the server and the client. So I use solid-state subscriptions to keep the Turf state updated between the server and the clients, and then the way to keep those up to date basically is, or the way for players to interact is basically to suggest updates to the state, and then the server can reject or accept those. So basically, it's not too complicated. It's just some extensions on top of solid-state subscriptions, so that you can keep track of which suggestions. So first of all, you can suggest suggestions, which is not included in the basic solid-state subscription library, and you can keep track of which one of those are confirmed or rejected. And then in the UI, you can do optimistic updates. So you do an action, you assume it works, and you display the state as though it worked. And then you get the update saying, yes, that worked, or no, it didn't work. And if it didn't work, you roll back. So it's, there's a decent amount of extra code to make that work, but conceptually, it's not too complicated. You're just keeping track of whether whether a person's actions were rejected or not. Does that answer the question?
Yeah. Cool. Thank you. Your poor voice.
I know. I shouldn't have.
We've got about 15 minutes left. I've been told that we have to vacate the stage immediately, or there will be heavy repercussions. I want to move to a few maybe fun topics near the end now. Roy, I'd love to know about some of your favorite games and why those are WoW and League of Legends in particular. And if you can answer it, I would also really love to know why we haven't had any more great MMOs since WoW came out.
I think that's probably an easier question to answer than the first one. So yeah, I was thinking last night actually when we were having this email thread about like what is my favorite game? I've played like hundreds of them. I guess it's probably the one I've spent the most time in. So I said, okay, well I've spent a shit ton of time in World of Warcraft and a shit ton of time in League, so that's probably it. But I think like why these games are so mainstream, popular and successful. I think in WoW's case, it's like, this is like really one of the first metaverses. I mean, before that you have like EverQuest, but World of Warcraft was really the first like super big one, where this sort of even entered the public consciousness of, you had like Facebook moms before even Facebook, they were like playing World of Warcraft, which is kind of trippy. And then like in League of Legends case, they sort of like mastered like this sort of like the narrative world where they got like everyone to like at least one of their characters. And the thing about League of Legends is like they have like 200 now or something like that. And so there's probably like, you're gonna like one or two of them, you're gonna hate the rest of them, but you're gonna find a few of them that you like, identify with. So I think that was what made League of Legends so successful. And definitely, I don't play that game anymore, I rage.
Did social media kill WoW? Is that
did it? I think the metaverse like moved, right? So like it was in games, and then everyone was playing video games, and then like everyone sort of like moved to like Twitter and Facebook and like MySpace back then in the ancient fossil days. Yeah, I think there's definitely like a conversation to be had there where it's like, if there is like a game that people play, like they probably spend less time on Twitter, or they probably spend less time on TikTok, Instagram, whatever, if they're just in a game and they can talk, through that game with their friends. So.
What was your race and class?
I was a protection paladin.
Okay. Race?
Always got the hand of protection. Human. Okay. The most boring one.
Yeah. No, I was a human too. Yeah.
But I think in general, like, your second question, like, sort of why like MMOs have kind of died out.
Yeah.
I think in general, it's like it kind of feels to me, and I know like Riot is building their own MMO, but like this is more of a gamer discussion. But I think the MMO genre is kind of dead. People have kind of played it out, and people want more things that are more engaging, more immersive these days. They want more excitement, and I think that's something that MMOs just can't really provide these days in terms of, even from a gameplay perspective. Like, who wants to sit there like, hitting keys all day? Like, you look at the most popular games these days, it's way more immersive. Like, I remember, so I don't play FPS games, but I downloaded Call of Duty Warzone, maybe like last year after not playing any FPS for like a long, long time, and like within like a minute, I was like panting and sweating. I was like, oh my god, this game is like crazy, because it's just like, wow, like so many things are happening and explosions, and like, that's what games are, and like.
Yeah, if you want to feel old, go try Fortnite for a little while, like as like an.
Oh, I did.
WoW.
I downloaded it. I dropped down and I got killed and I uninstalled it.
Yeah, as like a WoW player, like I loaded Fortnite for the first time and I'm like, my god, I have aged out of games like this now.
Yep.
Same question for you, Lewis. I would love to know about some of your favorite games and sort of what you've taken away from them.
I think like, early age, like Pokemon, that type of like immersive, like Game Boy era RPGs. I remember.
What was your first Pokemon?
Probably Charmander.
Okay.
Red version.
That's a good one.
Represent.
Yeah.
And I don't know, in your adolescence, and you're like, oh, you're playing, I don't know, like RuneScape, Team Fortress 2, and you realize there's like a meta game to this game, which is like the economy, and that economy can, be played with. Or in the case of like something like RuneScape, botted. In the case of something like TF2, you become some sort of like, mercenary key and hat trader. So, you start to like establish these like perhaps skills, ideas.
Yeah.
Perhaps most importantly, the idea that like a game, like the game space of the game is more than like the code. It's more than the matches and inside the engine. Like there's pieces of the game that extend out into like the real world.
Were you always attracted to those games that had some of those economic models to it? I know for me, I rated competitively in WoW, and then more and more I found myself like scripting things for the auction house to trade items, and like discovered one day that I was basically a day trader, and I was like, okay, well maybe I should go try something else at this point. But has that been an attractive piece of games for you?
I think it's like periodically. It's kind of like, if you stumble into a game and it has that aspect, then you are kind of groomed into becoming that. Like, in part of getting good at the game is also getting good at the meta game.
Yeah.
And so certain games have become like kind of conscious of this, right, in the past like 10, 20 years. And so they start to, especially in the last 10 years, start like baking that in of there's like, there's a meta game to be played. And so like as you're playing the game, you're also like going into these other behaviors that are now more and more, I think, intentionally designed. And for example, like the lowest tier of that would be like microtransactions.
Sure.
Just like, okay, play this game, but now just like keep getting out your wallet and like giving us more money so you can like kind of run in this rat race.
Yeah, Pokemon Red would be a very different game today if it was released versus when it actually was. What was your favorite era of Pokemon game? You have one?
Probably that era, you know, just pure nostalgia factor.
Yeah.
It kind of like fell off after like, Gen 3, but...
Yeah, agreed. Trent, this might be a dangerous question to ask you just because the library of games is vast, but tell us about some of the like standouts for you.
Yeah. So I'm really a Nintendo guy. So I was also a Pokemon Gen 3 kid. But I think the reason why I love Nintendo so much is because their games are just so playful and interactive. So at least in the context of single-player console games, your options are like Nintendo or interactive movie. And I'm not really into interactive movies, and so I like Mario because it's so immediate and it's so creative, and you're constantly doing things. I like the new Zelda because every facet of that game is so interactive. You play a lot of AAA games nowadays, and it's like the environment of the game kind of feels like a secondary thing to the actions that the characters are programmed to take. When you play the new Zelda game, it's like the environment is a part of the game. You have to really pay attention to, am I walking on grass? Am I walking on dirt? What's above me? And it's so deeply interactive and emergent. And I guess to tie it back to Urbit and to crypto and all of this, I think emergence is a big part of what we're talking about, which is that surprise is fun and unintended consequences are fun, and in this eventual world of infinite AI where anything can be generated, like an infinite story where anything can happen isn't actually that interesting. What's interesting is a constrained set of rules that produce surprising consequences and side effects, and I think that's what makes games so fun. And hopefully that's how we can keep technology fun into the future.
And you feel like, I mean, we've talked about Zelda a bunch. I think Zelda is probably the newest iteration that shows something like that. Were there games early on that gave you that sense, that sort of showed you that was a possible experience to have?
I mean like the Mario 64 and Zelda on the N64, those games too.
Yeah.
Those ones were less emergent in the context of combining items and building things, but games that are focused on gameplay and play are still very emergent, even just in the context of like, you're playing Mario 64 and you've done a double jump and there's a ledge here and you like kind of have to manage your momentum in such a way that you're making a decision, okay, do I do a wall jump now? Do I do a triple jump now? You get a lot of emergence just out of having an interesting set of controls and an interesting set of rules that give you immediate feedback. And so I really think emergence is the key word when it comes to what makes games enjoyable.
It is like striking that Zelda is maybe one of the first examples of a contemporary game that people point to as like having these kinds of the kinds of properties that at least I think of like older like classic games being such clear examples of. Roy, like has game development actually just gotten worse? Like are we being overly nostalgic, or is there a reason that games like Zelda, like some of the things that Trent is describing, have become maybe more rare?
I think gaming is entering the golden age, man.
You think it's entering the golden age?
I think it's going to get even more insane.
Convince me.
Well, I mean, just look at the amount of money going into games, right? Like that. Like, I think we're having So Rockstar spent, I think, about $2 billion so far on Grand Theft Auto 6. They don't talk about it. They're just going to release it one day. Here you go, GTA 6. And it's going to be like one of the greatest games of all time. I'm very curious to see like what's a $5 billion game going to look like? What's a $10 billion game going to look like? And this is going to happen.
Do you think quality will scale with money to?
No, I think quality sort of. I mean, I actually know this very intuitively. Quality, you sort of like hit a wall at a certain point where it's like, okay, like to actually get this 20% better, we need to spend like millions and millions and millions of dollars. So at a certain point, the quality is just going to sort of hit like this ceiling. And also, gamers don't really care too much about fidelity. Like, I mean, I'm sure everyone here like plays games just to play games for the fun.
Yeah.
Like, you know, no one really gives a fuck about like, oh, it's so realistic looking, and like that's not really so important. So I think fidelity is going to improve, but I don't think it's as important as like the fundamental mechanics, which are things that we're going to have completely brand new games that no one has ever seen before. I think platforms like Urbit, infrastructures like Urbit, are the ways that we're going to see, you know, Web3, crypto, et cetera, are the ways that we're going to see new sorts of avenues of play, new ways to socialize with each other, new forms of media even, and yeah, what even is a game?
So we've got things to look forward to.
Yes,
then.
absolutely.
Okay. Maybe most of all, Shadow War.
Yeah,
Although
maybe.
you're going to have to tussle.
Well, no, I'm actually looking
on
forward
turf.
to the next Legend of Zelda also.
Okay.
I'm a big fan.
Yeah, Zelda is very good.
Yeah.
It's been taking up a lot of TV time in our house
It's
as well.
dangerous. Yeah.
Yeah. John, do you want to share some favorite games?
Yeah, sure. So I think my favorite game is definitely The Witness. Jonathan Blow is a genius, and he did a really amazing job in that game of, you know, evoking the feeling of like amazement and discovery of like, you know, something clicks and suddenly the world around you is different, and that keeps happening throughout the game. And it's one of the best experiences playing a game through that I've ever had. As far as replay value goes, I find myself coming back to The Binding of Isaac. Again, there's that emergence with items you pick up changing, you know, the way you move, the way you interact with your environment, the way your attacks work. It's just, you know, there's a lot of different things that can happen in a run of Binding of Isaac, so that's really fun. I'm not very good at it, but I play it time.
Cool. Well, to end off the panel, let's do one game recommendation from something that you guys have played recently. You don't get to say Zelda because you recommend Zelda all the time. So one from everyone. John, you want to kick us off?
Something we've played recently?
Yeah.
What have I played recently? I don't play games that much. Let's see. Okay, this isn't that recent, but I'm going to recommend Kerbal Space Program. Kerbal Space Program. You'll learn about orbital mechanics, and you'll accidentally kill some little green guys, and you'll have a fun time building, you know, rocket ships that actually follow some sort of mathematical equations, even if it's not fully realistic. So I spent a lot of time in that one.
Nice.
Something recent I've been playing that people might not have heard of, F-Zero 99 on the Switch. If you pay the $20 a year subscription for the online, it's free for you. It is a 99-player battle royale racing game where half the goal is just to even make it to the end of the race because you'll probably blow up and you won't finish. It's so intense. It looks like a Super Nintendo game, but it's like modern game. It's awesome. Play it.
Nice.
Yeah, I'm like fighting with myself on which one I should recommend, but I think if you're just looking for a good time, Octopath Traveler 2, you would actually probably like that one.
I played a little bit of the first one. Yeah.
Oh, you played the first one. Yeah, it's a very fun game. It's sort of like a nostalgia factor, trying to like sell you on the nostalgia. You play, it's made in Unreal Engine, but every character is made in this sort of 8-bit style. And yeah, just a really fun game. It's fantasy, build your party, go out, kill things, get loot. Fun game.
Nice.
I don't know, I've been getting back into chess recently.
Yeah. Okay.
The chess recommendation.
Solid recommendation.
There's also this game called 5D chess.
Yes.
It's very interesting, and I recommend chess.
5D.
Yeah.
Because 4D,
It has
4D chess wasn't hard enough.
Well, because you have like time travel, so I think you need the extra 2 dimensions
Okay.
back and laterally. It's quite a fun brain teaser.
Okay, that's fun. For me, Mario Kart. There's nothing better than beating the Japanese player at their own game when you wake up at 2 a.m. to go against them, and occasionally get a win.
Ask Chase about his competitive Mario Kart.
I'm quite serious about my Mario Kart playing. Yeah,
Did you trash talk in Japanese?
I do. I emote in Japanese. Yeah, that's right.
Nice.
Cool. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. This has been gaming with Urbit, Urbit Gaming, Web3. I don't know. It's gaming.
Gaming the system.
Gaming the system. There we go.